On June 18, 1812, the United States declared war on the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. For years, the British had been forcibly removing Americans from merchant ships and enlisting them in the British Navy. So, when American bans against British trade failed to make Britain fold, President James Madison felt obliged to raise the stakes, so to speak. It was, at least in part, a bluff. As it was, the British only had half an eye on the game, distracted as they were fighting a certain megalomaniacal emperor in Europe. In poker terms, however, the US did not have a winning hand. Funding the war would pose an immense problem. The year before, Congress had decided not to renew the charter for Alexander Hamilton's Bank of the United States. The reigning Jeffersonian Republicans, after all, were the party of limited government. Earlier in 1812, even with war looming, it had rejected a bill to build more warships. It did authorize the president to call 100,000 militiamen to service, but many believed that constitutionally these could not serve abroad, which was a hang-up to say the least, considering America's war plans centered around an invasion of Canada. So no central bank and a limited military. Sure, we'll raise you a capital city in flames, why not? How would it all play out? Stay tuned, it's the War of 1812 on this episode of Bigfoot's Great American History Show. In the summer of 1812, the American war plan called for 3 concerted attacks against Canada. In the west, General William Hull marched 2,000 troops on British Fort Malden. Alas, upon reaching the Canadian border, 200 militiamen refused to cross, on the constitutional grounds that they were a defensive force only. Once in Canada, Hull received word that the British had taken Fort Macdonough to the northwest. With his supply lines already threatened by Tecumseh's Native American warriors, Hull ordered a retreat and, for good measure, the evacuation of Fort Dearborn in the west. On August 16th, facing British cannonade, Hull surrendered at Fort Detroit, prematurely in the eyes of his subordinates. Hull would later be court-martialed for cowardice and neglect of duty and sentenced to death, a sentence President Madison commuted to dismissal from the army on account of Hull's Revolutionary War service and old age. In October, an American force including a young Winfield Scott captured Queenston Heights on the Niagara River. Once again, however, state militia refused to cross into Canada. Without reinforcements, the Americans surrendered. A month later, the largest American force under Henry Dearborn set out for Montreal. Yet again, militia refused to cross the border, and the attack was abandoned. A mere 3 days after the surrender of Fort Detroit, William Hull's nephew Isaac, a hero of the First Barbary War, would redeem the family name. At sea, 17 warships, 7 of them frigates, represented the entire American naval force, with Congress having defeated a bill to increase it only months before. By comparison, the British Royal Navy boasted over 1,000 ships, with about half at sea at any time. Most of these, however, were tied up fighting Napoleon or otherwise occupied around the globe, leaving in North America 1 64-gun ship of the line, 9 frigates, and 27 smaller vessels. On July 12th, Captain Hull's USS Constitution encountered 5 ships off the coast of New Jersey. The next morning, he discovered that these were not the American ships he had been ordered to join, but rather a British squadron, including the newly arrived HMS Guerriere. Desperate to get away, but with no wind, Hull unloaded 10 tons of drinking water and ordered his men to tow the Constitution in rowboats. The British continued to close, however, and in the end the Americans resorted to kedging, or rowing an anchor ahead of the ship, dropping it into the sea, and winching the ship forward. At last, on the 3rd day of the chase, a favorable breeze took the Constitution out of British range. A month later, Hull encountered the Guerriere again. This time, in arguably the most famous naval battle of the war, the Constitution won a decisive victory, earning the nickname Old Ironsides, after British cannonballs were seen bouncing off its hull. Over the following months, Hull's fellow Barbary War heroes Stephen Decatur and William Bainbridge would win important naval victories over the HMS Macedonian and the HMS Java, respectively, providing a much-needed morale boost to the American war effort, which had struggled so mightily in Canada. 1812 was an election year. The opposition Federalists nominated no one, and chose instead to secretly support Republican challenger DeWitt Clinton of New York. Yet with failures in Canada relieved in part by the rousing victories at sea, James Madison successfully won re-election. Still, in other races, an unpopular war helped Federalists make their largest gains in 20 years. indeed, the military failures in Canada could not be ignored. Accordingly, the president replaced both his secretaries of war and navy. Congress approved 22,000 more regular troops and increased pay for soldiers. Meanwhile, the naval heroics of Hull, Decatur, and Bainbridge convinced Congress to approve the construction of 6 additional frigates and 4 ships of the line. With the charter of the Bank of the United States lapsed and importation of British goods banned, funding for the war fell dangerously short. In 1813, Congress finally passed a tax bill, including a land tax, excise taxes, and a duty on salt. In 1813, the American war plan called for the severing of Lake Ontario from the rest of Canada via attacks on Kingston at the St. Lawrence River and Fort George at the Niagara River. General Dearborn, however, fearing British troop strength at Kingston, chose instead to attack York, the capital of Upper Canada, which otherwise held limited strategic importance. Accordingly, General Zebulon Pike and Commodore Isaac Chauncey led a successful attack on York, though at the cost of Pike's life, whereupon an unknown party made the unfortunate decision to set fire to the Canadian Parliament buildings. The British would not forget it. A month later, Colonel Winfield Scott led a successful advance guard in the capture of Fort George. General Dearborn was shortly replaced by the notorious James Wilkinson. That autumn, Wilkinson led a march on Montreal, accompanied by Scott. In Scott's absence, the British ousted the Americans from Fort George and, for good measure, Fort Niagara. Meanwhile, Wilkinson's rearguard suffered a crushing defeat at Chrysler's farmhouse, and the army never reached Montreal. Captain Broke and his crew have vindicated the character of the British Navy, wrote the London Morning Chronicle, following the HMS Shannon's capture of the USS Chesapeake. Indeed, in 1813, the Royal Navy would reassert its dominance on the Atlantic. All the same, the dying words of the Chesapeake's Captain James Lawrence, "Don't give up the ship," would soon become the battle cry of the American Navy. On Lake Erie, Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry emblazoned the words on his battle flag. Perry's own words would soon join Lawrence's in the annals of American history. "We have met the enemy and they are ours," he wrote triumphantly to General William Henry Harrison on September 10th, following a pivotal naval victory at Put-in Bay. The British, having thus lost control of Lake Erie, shortly abandoned Michigan. General Harrison pursued the retreating army to Moraviantown, where his troops defeated first the British and then the Allied warriors under Tecumseh. Here, Tecumseh himself died, along with his dreams of a Native American confederacy. Meanwhile, in Alabama, civil war broke out between the Upper Creeks allied with Tecumseh, called Red Sticks, and the Lower Creeks, friendly to the United States. On August 29th, Red Sticks led by Chief Red Eagle attacked Fort Mimms, killing hundreds, men, women, children, whites, blacks, and Lower Creeks alike. The massacre shocked Americans in the Old Southwest. Enter General Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory to his followers. In 1814, he displayed many of the traits that would later define his presidency: a lust for Native American land, an unwillingness to tolerate disobedience, and a knack for getting things done. In March, Jackson led an army of Tennessee volunteers, along with Creek, Choctaw, and Cherokee allies, in a decisive victory over the Red Sticks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. "My people are no more," cried Red Eagle after the battle. The Creeks, both friends and enemies, were subsequently forced to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson, ceding over 22 million acres of land to the United States. In later years, the Choctaws and Cherokees would also have cause to regret their decision to ally with Jackson at Horseshoe Bend. In 1814, Napoleon abdicated, following defeat at the Battle of Paris. As one British editor put it, until then, half of Britain had not even realized they were at war with the United States. No longer fighting with one arm tied behind its back, Britain promptly sent more troops to America. In August, over 4,000 regulars arrived in the Chesapeake Bay. The Madison administration had not expected an attack on Washington, given the city's lack of any strategic importance. Ironic that, considering its own attack on York the year before. On the 24th, following a rout at Bladensburg, the British marched into Washington and, with the burning of York in mind, set fire to both the Capitol and the White House, though not before helping themselves to a dinner already set on a White House dining table. Earlier, with the president in Bladensburg, it had fallen to Dolley Madison to organize the evacuation of state papers from the White House, along with, famously, a portrait of George Washington. Meanwhile, the largest British force in America invaded from the north. 15,000 men, led by Lieutenant General George Prevost, following the ill-fated route British General John Burgoyne had taken prior to his surrender at Saratoga in the American Revolution. On September 11, 1814, American Commodore Thomas Macdonough defeated a British naval squadron at Plattsburgh Bay, utilizing anchors that allowed his cheekily named flagship, the Saratoga, to rotate 180 degrees in place. Having lost control of Lake Champlain, Prevost fell back to Canada. 2 nights later, the British bombarded Fort McHenry in the Chesapeake Bay. The next morning, lawyer Francis Scott Key penned a poem in honor of the Star-Spangled Banner that yet waved in the light of bombs bursting in air. With Britain's invasion now doubly stalled, on Christmas Eve both parties agreed to a treaty that returned all territory to the nation that had held it prior to the start of the war. Notably, the Treaty of Ghent made no mention of impressment, the primary American complaint against Britain in 1812. The British, too, had originally hoped to win concessions for themselves and their Native American allies. Yet for both Britain and the United States, the bets, so to speak, had risen to more than they were willing to pay. In the end, the two nations agreed to walk away without revealing their full hands. Before news of the treaty arrived in America, however, the British had already launched the third arm of their invasion plan. In January, Old Hickory led a force including the French pirate Jean Lafitte in a successful defense of New Orleans. I'll post a video on the Battle of New Orleans here, just as soon as I've made it. What was the most important legacy of the War of 1812? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this episode, do me a favor, like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Until next time, this is Bigfoot saying so long, and save me a seat at your next campfire.